Hey there, readers and storytellers, and thank you for joining me on Story Unfolding, a show about changing the world through creativity, ingenuity, and intellectual discourse. We share meaningful conversations with creators, creatives, and dreamers who take it upon themselves to make a difference in the world. We have an influence on the world around us regardless of our intent. The only way forward is by confronting the hard truths, asking the tough questions, and letting your voice be heard. We are better together each day with our human story unfolding. Now, I am pleased to have Tiffany Terry on with me today. Tiffany, or TNT as her friends call her, has wanted to be an author since the sixth grade. After years of professional writing for executives, she finally pursued her dream of writing and self-publishing a young adult fantasy trilogy. Tiffany shares her story of healing from trauma through her stories and creates clean books where the kids don't choose to change the bad boy. Now that's a mouthful. And Tiffany, I am so happy to have you. I would love to hear more about you, and I can't wait to get into this interview. So thanks for joining us. Why don't you share a little bit more about you?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Appreciate your time here. I think you kind of wrapped it up pretty nicely. I don't have much more to say, I think, about who I am and what I do.
Oh, that's fine. So those, I don't want to take your glory. So those are your words. Those are Tiffany's words. We do a written portion of this interview, and I read it verbatim from what she wrote. So those are directly from Tiffany through me. So I was just a messenger. So that was a great intro on your part. So you can see behind me, what is it? Sister Worlds, right? Is that your trilogy? So Tiffany has 3 adult fantasy books out right now. And I'd love for you to share a little bit more about them.
Yeah, so Sister Worlds, the name of the trilogy actually kind of came about while I was working on the second book and getting, starting to plan for my third book. It really is about these young women who become like sisters throughout their individual traumas that they're dealing with, and then having to grow beyond that trauma in order to become strong enough to work together and help save each other's worlds and save their worlds from, the men, the machines, and the monsters that are out to get them. So it's definitely wrapped around that theme of chosen family, fighting together, getting through what you've been through, and kind of putting that to the side to make sure that you identify who you've become through your past, and then you make the decision on who you want to be in your future. And so it's very coming of age. It's more speculative. So you've got the fantasy elements, you've got some sci-fi mixed in, you've got some steampunk in there. 2 different worlds that were once one world that was divided by a dragon sorcerer, right? So there's all sorts of fantasy elements in the trilogy.
So you got the best of all worlds for everyone, every type of reader.
Yeah, that's what I tried to do. I tried to pull it all in there. Didn't want to leave anybody out.
That sounds great. So you've been working on this project for a long time, right?
Yes, I started dreaming up my main characters in the first book when I was back in high school, and I'm in my 40s now. So very long project in the making. I wrote my first draft in college. I was a professional writing major. And then out of college, I took a regular job and started doing the regular corporate world thing. And I became known as the writer on my floor, and managers and people started bringing things to me to proofread and edit and rewrite and format and make it look better and nicer. And so that kind of became its own position for me and became my career. But I always had that story kind of locked away, and it just kept evolving over time as I grew and evolved through some of my own personal trauma. And, I've talked with other writers who have maybe been sitting on a story and struggling with a story for a long time. And I really think that sometimes things just have to happen in your life before you are ready to tell the correct story. And I think I was still so stuck in my childhood trauma that any story I would have completed wouldn't have been the right one. I needed to come out of some trauma, get some healing, get some therapy, before I could really focus on the story that I'm meant to tell to young girls, young women, in order to help them maybe not make some of the mistakes that I made.
That's amazing. So as you were going through this process, was it a like not an afterthought, but I mean, you went into a different job, you had a lot of life experiences, was it something that you consistently touched on, or was it something that hid away in a dark corner of your closet and, every now and then you would come back to it?
Um, no, I think it's always kind of been there. I've always wanted to write books. And this was kind of my story. I would come up with so many different ideas, and I sort of said, no, I can't move forward until I get this project done. And I couldn't get the project done until I'd really had my heart broken and really healed from a long history of trauma so that I could tell the right story. And now I'm on to this. Okay, now what's next? Now, how can I write more books in order to pursue my dream of being a writer? But it was always around. I always had a file. I always looked at it. I was always thinking about it, outlining. I was always going to get there, and I did.
There's always the elephant in the room.
Yes.
So your characters, you have three main characters, or three girls. Around what age are they?
So Kalia is more of your typical 16, 17. She is in the first book. Kalia is also in the books that follow, but the kind of my main character in my Kingdom of Machines is Electra. And she is also around that 16, 17-year-old age. My youngest character is Princess Amira, and she is in all three books, but the third book is really the book about her, and her story. And she is on the younger end of the spectrum. So she's more 10, 13
Okay.
area.
Now, why did you pick these ages?
I just really feel like the young adult, like when you're in that stage of life, things are very confusing, very dramatic. I have this whole philosophy on why people love vampires around that age. I think there's a lot of like, you recognize if you have trauma in your life, but you can't yet define it or explain it or understand it. And you start making decisions based on that trauma without being aware of it. And so I think that's the perfect opportunity to kind of shed a light on, this age group, this time when you're trying to frame who you are and where you want to go and what you're going to be, as you're conflicted by your history, your past, your parents, who their expectations of you, the cultural expectations of you, and who and what you're supposed to be. I think we really want to empower this younger generation at this time, through these ages, and we want them to connect. At least I know I want them to connect with the characters at that age.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, you've touched on this quite a bit already, but I want to get in a little deeper about kind of the struggles and your lived experience. Like, what specifically has, inspired your writing, has created you into the writer that you are, and really helped you develop these characters?
I hate to say it's just like an innate talent, but it could have been driven by the fact I was still in this you can be seen but not heard growing up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed like every time I opened my mouth to say anything, I was shut down, and I would get into trouble. And so like every opinion that I had, I was immediately shut down for being too bossy, or I had an attitude, and just I was always constantly shut up, basically. So I went to journaling a lot, and I was in a very tense household, so I knew there were a lot of things going on, just because I could feel it. Like, I'm very empathetic, but I couldn't understand it. So I think that sort of kickstarted an imagination, and I always had such a vivid imagination. I could see things very clearly. I was haunted as a child. So just very in tune and sensitive. And the only way I could channel that was through journaling and through writing. It was my only acceptable form of escape because I had to be quiet and be in my room, and obviously reading. So that was allowed as well,
Yeah.
but not much else. And so I think that just kind of it became comfortable. And I didn't really feel like I was very good in school, except for when it came to reading and writing. And so my teachers only gave me attention whenever it was an English assignment or writing a paper. And so it was a way for me to get, recognition, accolades from people that I looked up to. And so it just sort of kept me engaged, and I just did it. I think you just get better at stuff the more you do it.
Yeah, so you've been touching a lot on trauma, and as you can see, the title I chose for this episode behind is inspired by, what I read from your answers on the written interview. And you have explained, and all you listening, you can go check this out on my website, michaelcanrealbooks.com. You'll be able to see the full written interview in the next couple of weeks. It will be posted, but it'll have all of Tiffany's words on there. But you go into a lot of anecdotes about your personal life and trauma you experienced. And you've touched on it here, how you've experienced it, through childhood and then again through adulthood. And now you're trying to kind of codify it in, this young adult age, as coming of age experience. How did you find, how did you blur those two together? Because you experienced it differently. You experienced trauma when you were young, trauma when you were older, and how did you find a unified kind of message to push in what you're writing, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think what I see in a lot of domestic abuse survivors, and whether that's emotional abuse or physical, is that we're not very good about speaking up for ourselves, standing up for ourselves until we have children. And sometimes it's that the need to protect the child really sparks a change in you. And when I had my children, that's when a change really started to happen for me, because I am very protective of others, not myself. And so I started to see my children in these characters and think about, if I was trying to prevent my children from living the patterns that I had lived and making the decisions that I'd made based on the patterns, what would that look like? And you can't always just come at people directly and say, don't do this, don't do that. That's going to lead you here. This is what's going on in your life. It's, how do I create these characters who were just maybe in not the greatest situations, and show how these characters recognize the situation that they're in, which not a lot of people do, especially young kids and children. And then how do I help them, how do I help these characters make better decisions through that recognition, and then grow, work together, be stronger together. And that's what I envision me putting my children in these spots, and how they would experience it with the guidance that I could give them, through the process. And so that's really how they were developed. It's part thinking about who they would be, part thinking about what I went through and what I would have liked someone to make me aware of. And then how can I turn these stories into stories that other young girls in similar situations could really connect with the message, but while also going on a journey in a fantasy world with characters that they enjoy in situations that they enjoy. So it's, I don't want to beat anybody over the head. These books are, from my perspective, not triggering. So there's no physical assault or anything like that, which has unfortunately started to find its way into some young adult books. But it's that very more subtle things that the characters notice and that they acknowledge so that the reader can perhaps pick up and acknowledge and realize that they maybe are experiencing something similar, and then realize that they also have the same strength within them to identify and to start making changes.
Okay. Yeah, I love that. I mean, that kind of answers my follow-up question. I was going to get into, how you think, books can inspire social change. So I know you touched on it a bit. And I'm not going to try and put words in your mouth. You're not, as you said, this wasn't intended to, beat people over the head. But we as writers, put out these messages, and they can be interpreted in many different ways by many different people. So I love that you're taking your readers on a fantastical journey, and I'm really interested to read them, especially given your covers. They're super interesting. But how do you think books in general, and then yours specifically, could in fact have that impact on society and social norms?
Yeah, well, so I'll go back to one of my favorite examples, vampire books and teenagers. So I think that people, younger readers, and this doesn't go for everyone, so it could be controversial, but I believe that vampires are narcissists. And if you have grown up in an environment where you're raised by a narcissist, what you're essentially doing is you're trying to earn love from someone who is incapable of giving love, right? And so that becomes the definition of love for you, is you are constantly seeking to earn love from people who are unable to give it to you in return. Now, some of those people may be narcissists. Some of those people just may have other things going on in their life, and they're just not that interested, but you're going to pursue the hell out of them because that's what you have been taught to do. Now, with vampires, it's a classic example of a vampire doesn't have a heart. They don't have a soul. They're the Walking Dead. They feed off of people to survive. Like, that's the ultimate narcissist. And our main character that, the readers love so much is killing herself to try to win the vampire's love. Well, then at the end of the book, the vampire changes, and all of a sudden, he has love to give, and unfortunately, that's not reality. The reality is a narcissist, 99.9% of the time, will never change. They, without years and years of therapy, they're never going to say, okay, yeah, I recognize I have a hard time loving people. I'm going to try harder. And then give you the love that you've been seeking this entire time, right? And so I think that I think people are addicted to it. I think people love this idea of like the 50 Shades of Grey, right? Like, they love this idea of chasing the man who they cannot get in real life, but through the character they get, because it gives them the sense of, oh, good, I haven't been chasing people for nothing. One day I'm going to catch someone who's going to change and love me. And I worry about those books in the hands of younger readers, because maybe if you are a younger reader that grows up in a completely healthy environment and you just read for entertainment and it doesn't impact you, great. But I think the majority, people who are reading at that age, are going to start thinking that that's okay. And it's going to start messing with their psyche even more, where they need to be reading about books about characters who recognize, nope, there's something wrong there. That person is never actually going to love me. They might be a good person, they might be a bad person, but it's not worth the effort that I'm putting in here to kill myself over. And what does a good partner look like? And what does a good friend look like? And, what does a good family member look like? And how can I be those people? And how can I choose those people? All in an adventure fantasy book, with strong female characters.
Yeah. That's amazing. I love that answer. You hit on so many important things. Yeah, I mean, your vampire example I haven't heard before, and that is just triggering my brain so many ways. It's so applicable. Um, but yeah, I know exactly which book you're talking about specifically, because in
I
my head,
think they're in so many. I really
they're
do. So many, like all of them.
yeah, in my head, I start my first thought when you said vampires was the vampire Lestat, and he is major. And do you read Anne Rice?
I read that so many years ago. I think I was
But
probably a teenager.
he is such a narcissist. I mean, you're so correct.
Yeah.
But yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But yeah, man, I'm kind of thrown back on that. I don't know where to go from there. I think I'm gonna drive it into another question instead, something that I asked you on the written portion. Because I don't want to dig too much deeper into that because that was a lot. That was absolutely wonderful. But one of the questions that I asked was it kind of goes off of this concept a little bit. Eckhart Tolle said that awareness is the greatest agent for change. In your opinion, what is the next step and how can writers affect this?
What did I say? Did I answer
So
that one?
you talked about your friend being an activist, I believe.
Oh, intactivist. Yeah.
Intactivist. That's what, okay. I wasn't sure what that was. I haven't looked that up. So I'd love to
Yeah.
hear more.
Okay. So I think everyone kind of has their cause, right? Like their purpose. And my best friend, she found her purpose. She is the mother to boys, and she is not from America. And she almost felt pressured to circumcise her sons at birth because it's a very American thing. It's our culture. And so she did a ton of research, and she joined kind of this group of intactivism. So it's you keep your boys intact,
Oh,
um,
got it. Okay.
the way that they were intended to be, and that circumcision is the same thing as female genital mutilation. We're still mutilating our body parts of our children for no reason, right? And by her by her being moved by this and by her putting information out about this, I became aware of it. I've never had any boys, so it didn't impact my life directly, but I've talked to my brother about this and other male family members, and it's become very eye-opening to me that it is a concern, and I do think people should look more into it. You're making this really big surgical medical decision on a child who has no say in the matter, and it is traumatizing to the child. And some people say it's the second biggest trauma next to birth for a child, and boys do die from it regularly. So it's really fascinating. And for me, you know my cause and my purpose through my writing is to reach young girls. And mine is to try to help them break those patterns of abuse, no matter what level of abuse they've experienced, but to try to do it in a, non-triggering kind of soft way, because behind every abuse, no matter what type it is, there's an emotional layer to it. So just looking at that emotional and that psychological layer and making those connections, that's my one cause. And many people have many different causes. I think it's great what you're doing on your channel and trying to help kind of spread that message of, if you love to write, great, but what are you writing about? And are you just out there for entertainment purposes? Or are you really trying to leave a legacy? Are you really trying to teach people something? Like, we've got a platform. Why don't we use it to spread our messages and help make the world a better place? Like, what other greater calling could there be?
Yeah. And I think that's a really important the whole reason I wanted to start this channel and start these conversations was, because people might say, I'm just writing for entertainment, but can you even do that? Because you're not in charge of who is reading and what their lived experience is and what their perspective is. You are responsible for the words that you put out, but those can be interpreted in so many ways. And I learned that, because I experienced a significant amount of trauma myself. And that's what I feel like it's kind of the cookie cutter mold of writers nowadays. Is a lot of us are coming out of trauma, and that's what inspired us to write. Because I've talked to so many who have shared traumas that I have, similar to you. And when I was writing, my characters were kind of going through these existential journeys and some of the travails that I experienced myself. And when I got it to my female editor, there were things that she was like, are you sure this is what you want to bring up? Because this is what I'm getting, and it's a little off coming out of you as a male. And I was like, well, those are things I actually experienced. There was trauma that I have experienced that are atypical for males. And I had to explain to her that, yes, this is what I want to, I want this to come out. I want these messages to be seen in my characters. But that was something that I realized I had to have that moment of internal, kind of thought and be like, do I actually want to have these conversations? Are people, when they read my book, if they ask these things that my editor is asking, am I comfortable with talking about it? Because when I was writing, it was a cathartic thing for me. I was writing through therapy and writing through my healing process. So I wanted to find that outlet, but at the time I wasn't sure if I actually wanted to have the conversation. So, that's when it was kind of unintentional when my editor started reading it. It was like, are you actually having these? Is this what you want to talk about? And I was like, oh, yes, I do, but that wasn't, I didn't intend to put it there. So yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to always have that thought, like, even if we're just trying to write, an entertaining story, it has meaning, and that's something that in my other persona, I run a, family travel business, and we try and help people travel with purpose. And we talk about, people moving around the world have an impact on cultures, environments, on everyone around us. And so often we live in our little bubble and we're just unaware of that impact we have on people. And that's what perpetuates negative impacts. And I feel the same, it can be said with writing and creating and everything that we put out on this platform. So if we're unaware, then we can be perpetuating negative impacts, negative problems. And I think it's our responsibility to, think about what it is that we're saying. So you've talked about a lot of great things. And one of the questions that I typically ask is, pick 1 to 3 social issues that are most important to you. I think you've touched on your number one issue, and that is, coming through trauma and working through abuse. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So
I think that's a pretty big thing. Well, and the fact that there's just not a ton of easy support out there, I would say. And not everyone is as lucky as I am, like leaving a domestic abuse situation is the most dangerous time for women. And a lot of women don't do it because they have no place to go other than to a women's and children's shelter. So it is, I definitely have a soft spot for those women who were not as lucky as I was in some situations that I was in, because I see it, I know it. And so I definitely care about that stuff.
now, if there's one piece of advice that you think you could put out to your readers, what would that be?
So looking if my readers are, the middle grade to young adult to new adult age, I would simply say, like, if they recognize, some of the patterns, that they should start researching. They can, if they're concerned about browser history and things like that, they can go to Chrome Incognito and, do research there and kind of identify patterns of behavior of people in their life. And if, they start to feel unsafe or uncomfortable, then they need to start reaching out to networks that are out there to help them get out of particular situations, or at least start making the right decisions and educating themselves on how to avoid certain situations.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I'm going to make sure to talk to you, and I'm going to do some research before we post this video. And we're going to have some links down below for some of those services that can support those girls that need that help. Now, before we end this, I want you to share with us anything coming up next for you, and where can we find you?
Yeah, so definitely find me at tntauthor.com is my webpage, and that'll have all of the links to my social pages. I'm trying to do TikTok. I feel very awkward on TikTok. And then I've got Facebook and things like that. All of my books are at Barnes and Noble. They're at Amazon. You can get them paperback or on your Nook or Kindle devices. And yeah, I'm pretty easy to contact if anybody wants to contact me and ask questions or anything too. So
okay, fantastic. Well, I will have all those links down below again to find Tiffany. And then, like I said, the written portion of this interview will also be on my website, michaelkimrealbooks.com. If you liked what you heard today, definitely click subscribe. I have a ton of other authors who've had amazing stories just like Tiffany and write amazing stories for you to read. So check them out as well. Tiffany, thank you so much for joining me. I loved having you, and I can't wait to talk to you again, hopefully about your children's books, which we didn't touch on another channel.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you so much, Michael. This has been fun.
All right, thank you all for listening, and read more and write mindfully.